read in today's paper, I'm sure that you'll recognize that yellow cab out there with Carl sitting in it. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, read the Sunday magazine section.
Good afternoon. Thanks for coming out today. What I'm going to do is just talk a bit about my writing career, and after that, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. I always tell people that my father was a sports writer at the Plain Dealer. He retired this year after 51 years of covering the Browns and the Indians and everybody else. And one of my earliest memories is seeing him sitting in his, boxer shorts with a day's growth of beard, sitting at the kitchen table, listening to an Indians game, can of beer there, and banging away on his little portable Olivetti typewriter. And I remember, back then thinking, that looks like a good job. So I always tell people that he was a big influence on me going into writing. I never got great grades when I was in grade school. I had a real sort of lopsided, I enjoyed writing and reading, and but always got I would get A's in that, and I would get D's in math and science, that kind of thing. And reading came very easily to me, and I really enjoyed it, and I kind of just concentrated in that area. My first real positive reinforcement experience was in the 4th grade when everybody had to write a story, and then everybody in the class voted on whose was the best. And it was around Easter time, so the prize was a chocolate bunny for the first prize. And I won that, and when I got home, I found out it was hollow. And I would later find out in college literature classes that was called symbolism. But I managed to avoid a lot of the heavy-duty math and science by changing schools and a lot. And when I started off at St. Ed's and in Lakewood, and for my first literature, English at St. Ed's, they introduced this thing called diagramming sentences. And I was just crestfallen because, I'd finally found something I could do, and they turned it into a math problem, But after St. Ed's, I went to Kent State, and I majored in journalism there for a few years. At that time at Kent State, that was, I was there from 74 to 78, so it was only 4 years after the shootings at Kent State, and there was, the faculty there was very, I guess the word would be paranoid about being politically, because people were describing Kent State as a political hotbed of radicalism and everything. And I was assigned to cover the Communists, Socialist Alliance, and all this sort of left-wing groups there. And I think my teachers felt that that I was too easy on them, and that I wasn't objective enough. So after a while, I eventually got kicked out of journalism. And they said, well, listen, we want you to, we'll let you continue in the journalism program if you will go and get a job at a newspaper and work there for a year, and then we'll let you come back and continue the program. And I was thinking, well, if I could get a job at a newspaper, why would I come back here and continue the program? I mean, isn't that the whole point of this? And so I changed my major to communications. I made journalism my minor, and I got out of school almost on time. I had to spend like another extra quarter there or something, finishing up some stuff. At that time, my dad said, why don't you, I could get you a job as a copy boy at the Plain Dealer, and then you could sort of, work your way up, start at the bottom and do that whole thing. But I couldn't bear the idea of that because he was so well known there. I knew that if I got a job at the Plain Dealer, people would say, oh, I guess your dad got you your job at the Plain Dealer. And so my senior year in college, I had also written a novel. And I took that with me and I moved to New York City. And I went to the Time Inc. building in New York City, in Manhattan. And in the Time Inc. building, they have Time Magazine, Life Magazine, Fortune, People, Money, HBO is in there. It's just this huge, and all my life I'd really sort of grown up reading Time Magazine, and it was really just a big deal for me to be like at the building. And I applied for a job there, and I figured, having come from Kent State and have the communication journalism degree under my belt, that I could, just get some sort of a lowly editorial job, but all they had open was, well, what I ended up with, I was in the sub-basement of the building sorting mail. And it was like this room about this size, and I was the only guy down there without a criminal record, you know, and we just threw the letters into, you know, Fortune, Time, Sports Illustrated, did that. And so I did that for 7 months, and worked at a sort of a free theater publication called That's Entertainment, where they would give writers free tickets to shows, and you would write reviews. So in that way, I sort of got my writing thing going. And the important thing is journalism is to have articles with your names on them, and that's what you show to people who you want a job from. So I was getting that by working at this magazine. After 7 months, I got promoted up to be the mail boy on the floor of Fortune magazine, so at least I got to be around people who were in journalism. I would be in their offices several times a day delivering the mail. And a while after that, the kid who was the mail boy at People magazine got fired, and I got put up to People magazine on the 29th floor of the Time Inc. building, which is really more my kind of writing, or my area of knowledge, being the arts and entertainment. So I was the mail boy up there, and I was constantly, you know, bugging the editors to give me an assignment and let me write something for them. And I sort of just wore them down because there were like 5 mail runs a day. So I was in everybody's office 5 times a day, and they couldn't get rid of me, and I had my clips with me from this little free publication that I was writing for. And eventually one of the editors took pity on me and said, okay, here's an assignment, go do this. And I think it was Hall & Oates rock band. I don't know if you might be familiar with them, but I went and did a story about them. And at the time, I had another friend who was a stand-in double for Dan Aykroyd. And at that time, Dan Aykroyd and John Belushi were making movies. I think they were shooting Blues Brothers at that time. And he was very good friends with them. And so when he would be invited to parties that they were going to, he would invite me along, and I got to know those guys. And so, you know, meanwhile, I did the odd assignment that I could bug out of an editor here and there, and, you know, started putting my clipbook together of stories I had worked on. And then this is like the weird thing about journalism. Usually a break for a journalist is usually something horrible happening to someone else. And this was the case here when John Belushi dies of a drug overdose, and nobody at People magazine had any connections with that group of people. And I just happened to be walking into one of the offices of the editors. They were having a meeting about how they wanted to put John on the cover, and but they said they didn't know, and they didn't have any contacts there. And I was just walking by, and I said, well, I know those guys, I could go talk to them, you know. And you know, they were totally shocked, but they said, well, just here, okay, you're not a mail boy anymore, now you're a reporter, go get that story. And so I went out and did that, and that turned out to be my first cover for People magazine. About 3 months later, I got the world exclusive. That was the first time Dan Aykroyd had spoken publicly about John's death, and so that was my second cover story. Following that, I went to El Salvador, and I did a story about a priest from Cleveland who was down there. He was running an orphanage down there, and this was right after the 4 nuns from Cleveland had been murdered down there. So that was sort of another coup for me. All the while, People magazine never put me on staff there, and I think the feeling was that I looked sort of like I look now. I had long hair, and I didn't wear a bow tie or anything. And at Time Incorporated, it's a very Ivy League run operation. All those magazines are full of people from Harvard and Yale, and I mean, they like to, you know, buy the stories off of me when they had them, and they couldn't get them anywhere else, but they didn't really want me on staff there. And another thing that was interesting about working for Time Inc., they have a system there, a journalism system, and it's called group journalism. And what happens is they'll send somebody out as the reporter, and the reporter will say spend a weekend or something with the subject, and then go home, transcribe the interview and your experiences with the person. You then bring it back and you give it to a senior writer. The senior writer then turns it into, you know, People-ese or Time Magazine-ese or Sports Illustrated-ese, and then it goes to assistant managing editor and managing editor, and the reporter gets his or her name on the story, but it's not like you wrote this, like you crafted this thing. I mean, the information that you got from these people is in the story, but it's not like you would recognize it in any other form. So when I was at Time Incorporated, the great thing about it was that I learned how to report. I learned how to, hook up with somebody who I had never seen before in my life, spend a weekend with them and get them to, spill their guts and tell you all the stuff you need to know for your story. And that was incredibly helpful. And it sort of got me over, I interviewed a lot of celebrities at that time, and it got me over the fear of, of interviewing someone who's famous. So after I'd gotten a lot of these sort of impressive clips for People magazine, I was called into the managing editor's office, and this was a woman who had given me my very first assignment at People magazine, and she said, I just wanted to call you in here. This was like the first week that she was made managing editor. She was the first woman managing editor of a Time Inc. magazine. Her name was Pat Ryan. And she said to me, I just want to tell you, you've done tremendous work here. You've gotten us some things we never could have gotten out elsewhere and otherwise, and we're just really appreciative of the work you've done and the stuff you've come up with for us. She goes, but I just want to tell you that you will never be hired here as a full-time writer or reporter. And I just didn't want you to waste your time hanging around here thinking that, sooner or later we're going to put you on staff full-time. And so she goes, if you get another job offer, please take it. And I just wanted to be very upfront with you about that and let you know right off the bat so you're not disappointed. So then I went around to everybody else who worked at People magazine, and I said, where did you work before you worked here? And I talked to a guy named Jeff Jarvis, who is now, maybe you read his column in TV Guide. He has that critics column in TV Guide. And he had just come from the San Francisco Examiner. And he had said that he knew that they were looking for a columnist in San Francisco. So I put my clips together, and I sent them out to the San Francisco Examiner, and I went out for an interview, and it sort of went back and forth, and eventually I got the job out there. The San Francisco Examiner is an interesting paper. It's the flagship Hearst paper, and William Randolph Hearst, who brought us the Spanish-American War, had long died by the time I got there, but his grandson, William Randolph Hearst III, was the publisher, and it was given to Willie, young Willie, as a sort of a way so he could teach himself how to be a publisher in the newspaper business. And so Willie had some different ideas about newspapering, and basically he just wanted to meet a lot of famous people and have fun. So what he would do, if there was somebody famous that he wanted to meet, he would hire them to come and work at the paper for a month or two. He called it a writer's program kind of a thing. And he was more interested in sort of magazine journalism because he had come from Rolling Stone and Outside Magazine. So basically at the Examiner, when I was there, they were turning out almost, it was like a daily magazine. There were really extensive features, and there was emphasis on the writing. A lot of times at newspapers, you're doing deadline stories on breaking news, and, they don't really care too much how fancy the writing is. They just get the stuff in the paper. And I had an editor there, her name was Glenda Hobbs, and she also had been a friend of Willie's from Harvard, and she was a creative writing teacher at Harvard, and she was my editor. And I had a wonderful opportunity there to have her as my editor, and she would sit down with me, and we would go over a movie review or a column I would write, and it was just an invaluable experience. It was like getting this Harvard education and getting paid to get it, and I was very lucky to have that there. And it was really sort of the opposite experience from People magazine, where that was all about reporting, and now here I'm at the Examiner, and that's all about writing. Well, they had hired me to write a sort of a nightlife column, and basically I would come in during the day, and I would hit the phones and find out who was opening a new restaurant or what band was playing at what clubs. And I would fill about 10 inches of space with that, and then the top 3 items were always things I would go out and get live. And I would go out at night with a photographer, and we would drive around San Francisco and find out what was happening. So the column would always have 3 pictures of something that had happened the night before there. And it was a lot of hard work, but it was a lot of fun. And I had never really, it was really my first real job, because at People I was just doing the odd assignments from time to time. But another good thing besides my editor, Glenda Hobbs, was all these famous writers were being brought in. I mean, you know, Willie was paying him a lot of money, and he would put him up in a nice hotel in San Francisco, and, you know, writers were glad to come out there and do that. And I got to meet Roy Blunt Jr., Hunter Thompson, all kinds of writers, and I got to hang around with them and talk to them about writing, and again, that was a really invaluable experience to have as a writer. And so I worked in San Francisco for 3 years there, and eventually I wrote a bunch of different kinds of columns. I had an editor named Dave Bergen who came in. He had come in from the Orlando Sentinel, and he brought in his own columnist, so he sort of sent me off to what they call the early morning weather rewrite desk, and this is where they send you when they just want you to quit and go away. So I took all my vacation, and I went back to New York to beg people for a job so I wouldn't have to, you know, in San Francisco the weather is always the same in the morning. It's always patchy coastal fog, so you have to come up with a way to write that different every day for a year, you know, until you just go insane and leave. So I took all my vacation and went back to all the people I knew in New York, working at various magazines, and begged them to take me back so I wouldn't have to work on the weather rewrite desk. And I had only been there about 3 or 4 days when I called back to the Examiner to see what was going on, and they said, well, didn't you hear Dave Bergen got fired? So the guy who had put me on the desk, apparently he and Will Hearst were supposed to come to New York for a big Hearst board meeting, and Dave forgot about it and just never showed up. So Willie Hearst fired him on the spot, and then I was called back, and I could have my column back. And an additional assignment I was given was being I was sort of like the swing critic. Any movie the movie critic couldn't get to, I would do. Any concert that the rock critic couldn't get to, I would do. And any theater that the theater critic couldn't get to, I would do. So I would do all sort of the second string stuff. And the great thing about writing about that sort of second tier of culture is that it would always appear in the back of the paper, and it wasn't so important. It wasn't so, I don't know, they let me have fun with it, and I could like just, you know, make fun of the stuff or just treated it unconventional ways, because a lot of it was unconventional stuff. So I had, you know, all of that was a great experience, and at the same time I had sent a travel piece to the Plain Dealer, because I was just trying to make a little extra money, and at that time the current TV critic Tom Farron was running the Sunday magazine, and I sent him a travel piece. And he said, you know, by the way, we are also looking for a rock critic to help out Jane Scott. You know, would you be interested in, you know, applying for that job? And I really wasn't interested in coming back to Cleveland, but I was thinking, like, if they fly me back for an interview, then they'll pay for it, and then I won't have to come home at Christmas, you know, and I could kill 2 birds with 1 stone. So I came back to Cleveland and did the job interview thing, and I ended up taking the job somehow, and well, part of what was interesting for me about it was the San Francisco Examiner was the second paper in town. The Chronicle was the morning paper, and most people got that. And so this was a chance to come to a bigger market, to the only newspaper in town. And plus I was also considering that the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame was going to come here, and I thought some great things, you know, could happen here. So I took the job in Cleveland, and I moved back to Cleveland. And they came to me and they said, what would you think about, you know, writing a weekly column about rock and roll? And this was probably about 6 months after I'd come back. And at that point, I wanted to write something more about rock and roll. I already had an idea in my head that I didn't want to be the rock critic forever at the Plain Dealer, because I was just sort of getting to the age where rock and roll just wasn't that important to me anymore, and I was more interested in other things. So when they asked me about doing a weekly column, I was trying to think of a title that was more vague and I could cover more things than just music. And there had been a radio disc jockey in San Francisco, and he reviewed like horror movies and karate movies on the radio, and as a joke he called himself the Minister of Culture. And so I just stole that from him as the title of the column that I write now, because it was just broad enough, and I thought it was, you know, pompous enough that it would be funny as a title. And so I've been doing that now for, you know, 6 years, and I'm no longer the rock critic. I write for the Sunday magazine now, And what's really nice about that is I get to spend a little more time on something for the Sunday magazine, do some reporting, and do some investigative type of things. And I get to spend about a month, working on these things. And I have the one weekly column, so it's a nice change between the long form and the short form. Oh, and incidentally, not a week goes by since I've returned to the Plain Dealer that I don't get a letter that says, "Oh, I guess your dad got you your job at the Plain Dealer," So basically you can't win. But if there are any questions about anything, I'd be happy to answer them. That's sort of like the story of my short writing career. Yes?
What do you see in the future for yourself?
I would like to do books or movies or something like that. Right now, just the thing is trying to get the time to do something while I have these other jobs. It's difficult to... It's tough after writing your journalism stuff all day or all night, whatever it is, then just switching and doing something else. I just don't feel like writing when I'm just done writing. And also, I think what's bad about newspapers is I have this immediate gratification thing where I write something on Monday and I see it in Friday's paper. And now if I'm working on a novel and I'm sort of like in the middle of it and I go like, will anyone ever want to read this? And you need that faith to believe that if you labor on this thing for a year or 2 years, that some good will come of it. And writing for newspapers, so now I've been doing that for 15 years, has sort of eroded my belief in that because I get to see everything real quick after I write it. Yeah?
Do you have trouble thinking of topics about what you can write? In New York, I can see where there'd be lots of material. In Cleveland, maybe not so much.
Well, I think that the world, the United States has shrunken, and that what's happening there, we all watch the same TV shows. The movies that open New York come to Cleveland. The bands that go on tour at either coast eventually get here. So more and more, it's sort of, like a little village. And, I read all the magazines that come out of New York. And but it's always difficult. Some weeks are harder than others to come up with a topic. But it just varies from week to week. And one of the toughest things is, there are some obvious topics like, Tanya Harding or something like that. But everybody's doing it. The tough thing is trying to find a different angle of doing that same column that everybody's doing.
You do a good job.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Some weeks are better than others. Yeah.
Okay, how would you compare living in San Francisco, New York, and Cleveland? Take housing, everything, weather.
Well, the other two places are a lot more expensive. Incredibly more expensive. There's a lot of glamour that goes with saying that you live in San Francisco or New York. That was just the bragging rights was part of the best part of living there. But for me, it's always just been the job. If I have a job I like, the rest of it doesn't matter. When I was pretty frustrated out in San Francisco for a while when I had these editors trying to fire me and stuff. And I wasn't looking out the window saying, "Oh, don't I live in this beautiful city?" I was upset that I didn't have the job that I wanted, or I wasn't, doing what I wanted. And I think what's funny about my career is normally in a journalism career you would start at a place in Cleveland, then go to San Francisco, and end up in New York, But I just did it all backwards. Yeah. It just depends on the individual because there are, journalists who write a lot of fiction. There's the guy, the mystery writer from Florida, Carl Hyacin, I think his name is. He writes 3 columns a week for the Miami Herald, and he has a whole string of really funny, great, mystery books that he's written, and he's very successful. I think it just comes down if you're a disciplined person and you're really driven, you'll do what you have to do, and if you're not, you won't. It just depends on the individual, I think. Yeah.
Could you speak a few words on the position people find themselves in looking for a job as you were? And a lot of people are told you can fit the mold, get this image in order to get the position. And one of the reasons I like you is that you don't fit the mold and you stand by what you believe in. And how do you address that in terms of where do you get the belief in yourself?
Well, early in my career, it was a real problem. It was like, I got kicked out of Kent State journalism. I was invited to leave People magazine,
And when, I told the San Francisco Examiner that I had an offer from the Plain Dealer, they said, oh, we don't want to stand in your way, go ahead. But what's funny, and I think a lot of that was because they thought I was unusual or maybe undependable even. They thought, maybe they took it even further than just looking weird. I mean, maybe he's, undependable in his work habits or something. But as it turned out, all the things that the other people didn't want me for is exactly what the Plain Dealer needed. And they told me when I came on there, they said that one of their big criticisms was that they were seen as not having a sense of humor. See, and now they can point to me and they go, well, we must have a sense of humor, we hired him, But so it was all those years, there was a lot of rejection and there was a lot of struggle, and it was worth it, in the long run. Okay, so there were a lot of nights when I was thinking like, maybe I should just, get the bow tie and get a crew cut and start doing what they want. But 15 years later, I'm in a really great position to write what I want and just have fun with writing. So I think a lot of it comes from having suffered through a lot of rejection, early on. Yeah.
Could you talk about one or two of the most memorable interviews you've done?
Well, doing the interview with Dan Aykroyd after John Belushi had died, it was very emotional, and he broke down and cried during some of it, and that was very, I'd never really been doing a story that would involve so many emotions. I mean, they were so close to the person I was talking to. When I had put a call into him, and I didn't know whether he would respond or not, and I just got a call, and it was him, and he just started talking, and I happened to be at home, and it was late at night, and I just started taking notes, like on the back of phone bills, just trying to keep up with him. And I said, well, I need to see you for, for more interview. And he said, well, tomorrow, he was calling me from LA. He said, tomorrow night I'm going to be in Toronto, because I'm bartending for a friend of mine. So I ended up just flying and meeting him in Toronto, and that's where we had the big sit-down for about 3 hours. And he's just a real interesting guy, and he was really open.
And I would say the other interesting thing when I was in El Salvador for People magazine, I was really afraid I was going to get shot a lot of the time, and I was there for 2 weeks, and it was just really, it was scary to do that, but exhilarating at the same time. It was like
Sort of like real war reporting. So those would be two I can think of offhand. Yeah?
How old were you when you started writing?
Well, like 4th grade, I mean, in school, like I said, I won that writing contest in school, and I pretty much continued to write after that, on and off. Yeah.
I thoroughly enjoyed Friday's commentary.
Oh, thank you.
It was an excellent.
Thank you very much.
It sounds like you're very happy with your life here in Cleveland and with what you're doing.
I am, but there's always more. I'm always looking for what's the next thing. I am happy here and I have a good thing, but I don't know. I want to keep growing in my writing. I'd like to get into something longer, like a book or something like that.
You do that in Cleveland.
Yeah, if I had the discipline. But I just got married and we had a baby, and so there's less and less time, to do the things that I need and want to do. Yeah.
Would you say that something that helped you was going out and getting to know various different people that you could connect with to get the story, like networking and that?
Yeah, a lot of things in my career happened through knowing people and through having a wide range of experiences. I mean, one thing of networking in journalism is to know all the other journalists. But if you have, a lot of journalists today they major in something else, and so that they have an expertise in another field and they know people from that other field, and those are their connections. And it's harder and harder to get a job in newspapers today because there's fewer and fewer newspapers. And every time a newspaper closes, there's, another 200 reporters and writers out there. So the number of, people in the field looking for work grows, and the number of jobs shrinks every year. So really, in order to get a job in journalism today, it's important. You got to be creative and figure out some ways to make yourself special and make somebody want you. Because, yeah, go ahead.
For like magazine writing as well?
Yeah, I would say just the same, and more so for magazines. Those are even, people want those jobs more than they do, the regular newspaper jobs. Yeah.
Could you address the issue of the stress that writers are under to come up with stories and the possibility of, I won't say lying, but addressing the truth and
Making up an idea. And I talked about that earlier, saying trying to find a new way, because all the columnists are looking at the same world events or same cultural events and trying to make some sort of sense out of them. So I don't think there's pressure to make stuff up, but there is pressure to come up with something. I do a column once a week. Joe Dirk and Debbie Winston and those people, they do 3 a week. I mean, that's a real grind. But I think what happens is that after you've done it for a number of years, you just know that you've always gotten something in, and it'll be there when you need it. But it can be, stressful to not have an idea the night before it's due. And the other thing, I just tell myself, look, they're not all going to be the greatest column I ever wrote. Some are, I look at it like a baseball average. Some are like home runs, and sometimes you strike out, but you got to live with that. That's, yeah.
and pretty short. What does your father think of your style of writing? And do you ever send him like short stories down the next year in publication? And the third one was you received a Friday article. You wrote a man's name there and said, now come on, we know that this guy is.
Who was it?
I can't remember.
Was it C.S. Lewis?
Yeah.
Okay. C.S. Lewis is a theologian who was he was alive and extremely popular around World War II, and I just happen to have read a lot of his books. I started when I was a kid. I read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which is a children's book that he wrote, which sort of kind of, in a fantasy fairy tale way, sort of explains the Christian mythology in a way that's real easy for kids to understand, and it's a great story, and he's a great writer. And the movie that's out, Shadowlands, is based on his real life. And what were the other? Oh, my dad. I think he enjoys my writing. I think he's really surprised at my success. We had kind of a rough go when I was in high school and college, because we were real different. And I was always getting kicked out of, school and, kind of making waves. And but it's funny that we were so different because I wasn't that interested in sports, and that's what his whole life was about. But it turns out now we're really a lot alike in a lot of ways now that we're both, well, I mean, he's retired now, but he's still writing and doing some things. And there was one other question.
Do you ever send in a
Oh, I haven't, I just haven't had the time. Yes.
Are you related to the birds?
Yes, my mother was one of the 15 herd kids. I have like 150 first cousins. Yeah.
the study that you sometimes write about in your column from your single day, is he a real person?
He started out to be a real person, then I just sort of took off from there, and now I can just guess what he might do in any given situation. And so I used actually a guy who works in the sports department, the boxing writer, Joe Maxey. He was the basis for Skidmore when I first started, but now he's sort of taken on a life of his own. Yeah.
Does your sister still have a television show?
She just signed with her show that was on ABC called Room for Two. That was canceled. And then she signed a deal with NBC like just last week, and she's going to be in a new show that starts in March, and it's called Girl in Progress. And she plays the mother of an 11-year-old girl. And the 11-year-old girl is the star of the show. So she'll be shooting it this month and next, and I think it'll air the following month after that. So, and she survived the earthquake, all right. Her chimney fell down, but that was all that happened. Yes?
Did your dad do a good job?
Okay.
Do you think journalists realize that I think the average person is really tired of hearing about it? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think, I think so, and I think that, you know, newspapers, what it has to do is like the placement of a story in the newspaper. It's one thing, I don't think you can ignore stories that are that, you know, they're tawdry and they're awful, but you don't have to put them on the front page. You know, I think if you could take something like the Bobbitt thing and, you know, run it once, you know, on 18B that it doesn't deserve, I don't know, but then there's pressure from other, you know, newspapers. If they're doing it, sort of that pack mentality, if somebody else is doing it, you feel pressure to do it too. It's, you know, it's also true of TV news. Like one of my beefs with the local TV stations is when they'll tell me some really hideous story that has no connection to Cleveland, like somebody chopped off somebody's head in Florida. I mean, that, you know, to me that's horrible, you know. We don't need to know that, you know. If it happened in Cleveland, I would like to know that somebody chopped somebody else's head off. But if, see, the thing is, you know, I hear this all the time. I know friends of mine who said, we just quit taking the paper because I don't want my kids looking at this stuff. It's horrible. It's garbage. It's, and they said, and it just, you know, it gives you a skewed view of the world. It makes you think that the majority of people are bad and doing these horrendous things when in fact it's just the opposite. And who needs to carry that around in their head all day? But, I don't know, if somebody was doing something horrible in my neighborhood, I'd want to know about it just for safety reasons. If a bridge fell down and you shouldn't drive over it, or if there was a crazy guy, you know, killing someone in my neighborhood, I'd want to know about it. And, I mean, that's why when I go to the newspaper every day, I'm like, I want to know what happened yesterday. But I think what we journalists need to do is talk about what's important, you know, and what do you place the top stories, you know, sort of like how do you judge what's important and, you know, what could be put on a back page. Yeah.
Related to that same issue, if you are an individual with limited time, you want to stay abreast of news and stories, etc. You can't, you still want to stay abreast of your own personal growth. So I know you've got a wide variety of background experiences. At what point do you trade off? And I guess I'm asking, how do you stay on top of it?
I just read all the time. I read, you know, we get at home, we get the Plain Dealer, we get the New York Times, and I get Time Magazine and Entertainment Weekly and Rolling Stone and Sports Illustrated, and, you know, I'm just reading all the time, and, you know, my wife gets mad at me all the time. It's like, get off the couch, why don't you do something? I'm going, this is my work, this is my job, I have to know this stuff. Yeah.
What do you think of the future of print journalism? You're spending a lot of money to feed these.
On the new plan?
Obviously, they expect the future. Your publisher certainly has something to talk about it. But there is another school that print journalism is going to disappear, or at least vastly change, given USA Today, TV, etc.
Well, they're real worried at the Plain Dealer because they're losing circulation in Cuyahoga County. And how can you lose circulation in a county where you're the only daily newspaper? So that shows you there's USA Today, there's the New York Times. You can get all these other things. You can just turn on the news for a minute and get that. So I think it's going to change. It's going to be different. Some things don't change, though. It's just like, I think it's like, you know, the cat food coupons, you know. I think people get the newspaper for that, or to read the obituaries. I was talking, I'm working on an interview with Bishop Pilla. And he was, you know, he's kind of mad at the Plain Dealer for the ways that we treat the sexual misconduct among priests and stuff like that. He was saying how unfair it was, and he said that, you know, if it wasn't for the obituaries, the Plain Dealer would lose a lot of readers because there's just no other place to get that information, and people are interested in that. But I just think, like, for those reasons, because of the obituary, because of the, you know, the food coupons, that people are just going to keep coming back to a daily newspaper. What scares me today is that kids who are not in the habit of reading. I grew up in a house where we all fought over the newspaper, and I don't get a sense from when I talk at schools that kids read, and that's where you're going to see it drop off fast. If they grow up and, you know, they're not in the habit of reading a newspaper, then, you know, I don't know what they're going to do with that plan out there, you know? Yeah.
Well, it seems then that worthy national, you know, and use like the New York Times and USA Cleveland, and some of the surrounding counties.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also good to know about what's happening, because it's not only, like you said before, the world is shrunk.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
It's getting smaller, and we need to know what's happening other than our own backyard.
The Plain Dealer does use a lot of stuff from the New York Times. If you look at most people don't look at where the stuff comes from. Or even the bylines of who's writing. I mean, I always have days when I go on vacation. It says under my picture in real small print. It says, "There's my picture," and it says, "Is on vacation today." Most people don't even read that. And I always get these calls saying, "Hey, great column last week. I think it was your best one ever." And so people don't really pay attention to who and where it's coming from. But there is a lot of stuff from the New York Times in the Plain Dealer. Yeah.
What do you think of George Will?
Not very much, yeah. I think he's just sort of a kind of a stuffy old guy who's, the thing I hate most about him, here's a guy, the only guy I know who could, he wrote a book on baseball, and, he made the subject of baseball as unfunny as the rest of the stuff that he writes about, I thought that was a real achievement on his part.
I think that's what I like about your column. I can understand the way
How I feel about George Will. Yeah.
Is there a columnist that you especially admire?
I like Dave Barry a lot, and he writes, he has that TV show, Dave's World, but you can get him in the Akron Beacon Journal, and thank God you can't get him in the Plain Dealer. I don't think I'd have a job. But I think he's very funny, and there's a lot of people that I really like to read. Roy Blunt Jr., mostly humorous, Hunter Thompson, a lot of the guys that I grew up reading, and P.J. O'Rourke and Rolling Stone I really like a lot. I don't know, do you guys get the Free Times out here? It's a free paper in Cleveland. It's a weekly. Anyway, Eric Broder is like a humorist for them. I think he's very good too. Yes?
Are you working on a book or a novel now, and would it be in the nonfiction or the fiction?
I'm working on a work of fiction right now. It's about a high school. It's about a high school kid in high school. It's the same one that I took to New York when I left Kent State. I'm rewriting it. Yeah.
And how practical do you think it is for an entry-level journalist to try and get a position like a columnist, a position on a paper? Do you think kind of unrealistic to aim for that to be your first job?
For your first job, yeah, I would say. Unless you've done some incredible things. Well, it also depends on the paper. I mean, if you're working for the Shopping News or a small, suburban paper, and they need you to do that. Well, I don't know. Hey, I left college and went to New York with my novel. I thought I was going to be Ernest Hemingway. I wound up at People magazine, but it was still, I would recommend people leave home, move out of town. I mean, and I think that's how you really find out who you are and what you're about. And I would recommend that to everyone in almost any field, you really do your growing up by leaving home, and going to another city. And I would say that was my most educational experience, was just leaving, the bosom of my family and go to New York City and San Francisco as well, just for the education of it. Anything else? All right, well, listen, thank you very much. I appreciate you coming out.